Philadelphia, and I am so thrilled to have you here this evening as part of our fall virtual speaker series. This is a very special event. It was supposed to be a live event. It is co-sponsored with the Alliance Française de Philadelphia, with Temple University Press, from where you can buy the book, their website, and the Barnes Foundation. And this was going to be a live book release party, but unfortunately we were not able to do it that way. So we are bringing the party to your living room, and we're so glad you're here to join us and all of our co-sponsoring organizations to celebrate the release of Terry Dolan and Lynn Miller's new book, Salut, the French in Philadelphia. Now, before we begin tonight, I wanted to let you know, I think you're figuring this out here. You should see the Q&A and chat screens icons at the bottom. If you have questions anytime, you can put the questions in there. I will be moderating the Q&A time after Terry and Lynn have their conversation with Martha Lucy of the Barnes. So please use that. And if you have questions about seeing anything, you can email, give a little chat to the panelists. Tess Galen, who is our fantastic events coordinator, will try to help you figure out your technology. Even though she cannot see your machine, she'll try to help you get everything straightened out. Now tonight, it is a delight to recognize, first of all, Martha Lucy, who is the Deputy Director for Research, Interpretation, and Education at the Barnes Foundation, and a specialist in 19th century European art, and a good friend of Terry and Lynn and all of us, and part of the Barnes, which is co-sponsoring this event, is going to be the conversation partner and moderating the conversation with Terry and Lynn. So we are so pleased to have you here, Martha. It's such a pleasure to meet you and have you here with us. And she will be leading the conversation with our two distinguished authors who most of us know well and love dearly. Lynn Miller, who is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Temple University, and the author, among other works, of Global Order, Values, and Power in International Politics, and Crossing the Line, which is a novel, Postcards from Delphi, a memoir, and co-author with James McClelland of City in a Park, A History of Philadelphia's Fairmount Park System, which is another fantastic book to learn more about Philadelphia for those of you who are curious about our history. With him is co-author Therese Dolan, who is Professor Emerita of Art History at Temple University's Tyler School of Art and Architecture. She is the author of Manet, Wagner and the Musical Culture of Their Time, and Inventing Reality, the Paintings of John Moore, and the editor of Perspectives on Manet. And we have had wonderful experiences with both of them speaking at the Athenaeum in the past. Terry just this past winter, I believe it was, before we had to close down, a wonderful talk about an Impressionist exhibit. And so we are so thrilled to have you all. I want to turn this over now to Martha to lead the conversation with the two of you, and invite everybody to virtually pull your hands together and welcome our distinguished guests this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome to everybody. I'm so happy to be doing this sincerely, because it has given me a chance to just dive into this amazing book. And if you haven't read the book yet, you must read it. It's brilliant. It's fun to read. It reads like a story. And I think that, that's sort of, in some ways, that's sort of the highest compliment I can give. The writing is just so good, and so sort of effortless. And there's this beautiful weaving together of history and art. And it's just, I personally learned so much about the history of Philadelphia, about the beginnings of the country. I mean, I've really been schooled in this stuff today and in the past couple months looking over this book. What it does is it's a beautiful weaving together of political history, social history in the U.S., and visual culture, and it takes all of these pieces of these sort of, I'm thinking of them now as kind of fragments of French culture, that visual culture that you see all over our city. But I've never really thought about them all together. And what this book does is it brings them all together, and it provides a context for them. And so you come out of it with this understanding of France's incredibly important role in the founding of our country, and in this city, and why there is such a French presence in Philadelphia. I also learned where the word Cajun comes from. I never knew that.
From a Cajun.
I also think that the way that the relationship between France, America, and England is discussed and explained, during the colonial and revolutionary periods was very enjoyable. Really nice to read. So my first question, I want to start by asking Lynn, just the very sort of general question of what inspired you to write this book, and how did you join forces with Terry?
What inspired me, I suppose, Martha, was simply my lifelong love of France and things French. From the time I was a child, I've known a bit about France, and I had my first year of graduate study in French-speaking Geneva, Switzerland. None of my academic work was about France, however, so it was always a sort of sideline of mine. And when I retired, I became a member of the board of the Alliance Française, which of course increased my interest. And then I began to do some actual research on things French in Philadelphia. And along the way, Terry Dolan joined the board of the Alliance Française. And my memory is that one day after a board meeting, I turned to him and said, given your interest in French Impressionism and my general interest in the history of the French in this city, why don't we collaborate? And she said something like, what a good idea. And that's how it started.
Great. I think that probably most people, or at least I, usually when I'm thinking about the origins of Philadelphia, I'm thinking about England. And what this book so beautifully shows is how important France was in our country's history from the very beginning, and in the city's history from the very beginning. I know this is a huge question, but how did that happen?
To whom are you?
I'm asking Lynn. I'm asking.
Okay. There's not a single thread, of course, but one of the things that I found fascinating early on in the research for this book was that William Penn, who could not have been more English, right? We know that he acquired the land we know as Pennsylvania because it was due to his father, who fortuitously died. He was the admiral who had assisted the monarch back to his throne. And Papa died, but before he died, he was terrified of the fact that his young son, 18 years old, was having his mind twisted by these strange, crazy people called Quakers. So he sent his boy off to Paris thinking that'll cure him. He'll spend a year over there and get these ideas out of his head. Well, young William no more than got to France, and probably as a result of something set up by Quaker friends back in England, he met not a man who was a humanist theologian, a Calvinist of sorts, but he had much softened Jean Calvin's doctrine. And this theologian then took him under his wing. Penn lived with him for the year he was in France, and the man said to him, by all means, follow your own creed here. Don't do what anybody else tells you. So he absolutely confirmed in Penn that Quakerism was the way to go. And you know the rest of the story, I think, from there. So it's French influence even on the young Quaker Penn.
And then into the sort of, over the next 100 years, you talk a lot about the influence of the French Enlightenment thinkers on people like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. The philosophes, the men of the Enlightenment in France, were the most important influence, I think, on the thinkers who wrote the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution. Now, granted, there were some English thinkers along the way too, but the English men of the Enlightenment period and the French generally supported each other. Some of them knew each other. John Locke, for example, was a kind of hero, being somewhat older to the French philosophe. And when the First Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall, they happened to have in the library there copies of the works of, well, not Condorcet yet, he was too young, but of Montesquieu and other French Enlightenment thinkers. And that's what these folks read. So people like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison were thoroughly imbued with the ideals of the French Enlightenment. And it all shows in our Constitution. Many volumes have been written, in fact, to make exactly that point, that our whole democratic system is very much built on the ideas that flow from the Enlightenment.
So one of the, and Terry, you should jump in here too. This shouldn't just be, right?
Well, thinking of Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, I mean, that's really how the art began to come over to Philadelphia, because once the revolution had happened, the Continental Congress decided to wanted to commemorate heroes. And because Franklin and Jefferson had spent so much time in Paris, they knew the best artists to send over, especially Houdon, who came back over on the boat with Franklin. Houdon was the first French sculptor, first French artist to visit America. And his bust of Franklin at the Philadelphia Museum of Art is just one of my favorite works. I mean, the characterization, he doesn't idealize him at all. There are wattles hanging under his chin, and he's just opening his mouth to say something, but he's caught the intelligence of this man in an incredible way. And Jefferson also recommended Peale, to paint a portrait of Washington for Houdon to use as a model. But Houdon said, no, I need to take measurements and body measurements and all. So really Franklin and Jefferson were very influential in bringing French art and understanding the influence of French culture to Philadelphia.
Okay, and I am attempting to share my screen. Did that work? Nope, wait. Are you seeing the Houdon? Yeah. And one of the threads that goes through the book is this discussion of America being this young nation that did not yet have a sort of visual vocabulary of its own, a sort of set of visual symbols of its own, and that it had to create these symbols. When did this first start happening? Would you say that it's, Terry, with portraiture?
Yes, absolutely, with portraiture. First of all, the arts in America, they had no native tradition. And if you wanted to be an artist, you went over to England, for example, to study over there. And most went over to, Benjamin West went over. He was born in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. And the provost of the University of Pennsylvania funded his trip to London, and where he remained and eventually became president of the Royal Academy. So Peale went over to study with him. And it was Peale's son who decided that he went also over to London to study, but then realized in doing the Grand Tour that there was an awful lot in Paris to look at also. And the Salon and the opportunities at the Salon, the prizes, the support of the government for the artists was something that was very appealing to artists at the beginning during the colonial period. I mean, the early revolutionary, post-revolutionary period.
And while we're talking about the Peales, are you seeing the Rembrandt Peale?
Yeah, this one was just amazing to me. This is a portrait that Raphael Peale, one of Charles Wilson Peale's 16 children, most of whom he named after artists, Sophonisba Anguissola Peale and Rembrandt Peale, Rubens Peale, etc. He taught them to paint. And Rembrandt, this is at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And what I think is most astounding about that is that portraiture is supposed to flatter the viewer. Now, David was in an accident when he was younger. And whenever his self-portraits always hide the deformity of his face. But he never allowed other painters to paint him, probably because of this. But he allowed Peale to capture him. Peale did a full face on portrait of him without idealizing him. So what it shows on many levels is the acceptance of the Enlightenment point of view that science is right. This is what the body looks like under certain circumstances. And I hadn't known it before I started. Most of the stuff I didn't know before I started this book. I learned so much, and it was really an adventure. I learned so much from, the many fine scholars about this, but this one really struck me.
That's so interesting. Do you know how David reacted to this?
He was fine with it. He was fine with it. Maybe he thought it would go to America, nobody would see it. This is, of course, before photography had been invented. And there were no art museums in America, except that Peale's father, of course, had started his own museum. And so he didn't know whether it would be seen there or not, but I don't have any of the reaction there. Yeah, there is Peale, the artist, in his museum that may have been influenced by a print, a sort of a print where he substitutes the turkey for the globe, and the extended view of Cardinal Mazarin. Yeah, right. So there were just a lot of really fascinating influences in early America coming over from France as a model for portraiture. And portraiture was the major thing. Portraiture sold best at the salon, was the major thing at the salon also, because that was a thing that you could buy very easily, court portraiture, and then the wealthy class always commissioned portraiture.
While we're talking about, I think it was so interesting what you said about this painting sort of making the point that science is right. While we're talking about that, that made me think of Eakins. So let's switch to Eakins for a minute, and realism and science. Your chapter, you've got a whole beautiful chapter on Eakins and his time in Paris. And so we know he was in Paris from 1866 to 1870. And in the studio of Gérôme, the academic painter, and you talk about this, and and this is something that's talked about all over the place in the literature a lot. There's so much written about Eakins and his relationship to the French Academy. But what you do in this chapter, which is interesting and new, I think, is you talk about the influence of the French avant-garde, because of course, he's over there during the late 1860s when Manet is making news. And I think I want to talk about that, but before we do, I think that this is a great painting to look at for a minute and to talk about how he is absorbing the French academic tradition, how you can see notes of Gérôme in this painting, but he's also making it an American picture. Can you kind of take us through this painting?
Yes. Basically, I mean, the subject matter is contemporary, which would come from the avant-garde painters, but the manner of painting is more academic in his attention to detail. The way he paints, for example, the trestle and the railroad bridge in the background, and the influence of that type of thing. Lynn, it was interesting, Lynn also set up a PowerPoint, and this was one that he chose also. And I was wondering why he chose it also. It is such a Philadelphia painting, for one thing. I never drive down when I always want to see, maybe Max Schmidt is out there rowing, but the bridges now are very different. But the academic aspect is the way that the picture itself is set up with layers of perspective going to the background, whereas the avant-garde painters of the time were really flattening the picture space, and also the brush strokes were much broader.
But also just his decision to choose a contemporary subject. I mean, and a really, really American subject with the Quakers. It's hard to see, you can't see in the background, but in the boat, people dressed in traditional Quaker costume. But Lynn, why did you choose this painting? What did you want to say about it?
Well, for the same reasons I think that Terry has just described, just to add one little comment, of course, Schmidt was also a friend of Aikens. Aikens himself was a rower. So this is not only an American scene and a Philadelphia scene, but it's a kind of intimate scene of a friend, which I think makes it even more remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Terry, what about the French avant-garde? Tell us about that.
Well, I kind of went out on a limb. I was very much helped by certainly Kathleen Foster and Elizabeth Milroy, who wrote just wonderfully about Aikens in Paris. I could not have done without their scholarship, and those are the top two, and there are many, many others also. But Aikens worked in the studio of Gerrard, as you mentioned, who was an academic artist, which meant that he adhered to history painting was the highest, that and the brushstroke you should sort of tiptoe over the surface of the canvas so that the brushstroke would not be seen. And Gerrard and Manet were arch enemies during that period. Gerrard really disliked what Manet was doing. And yet in 1867, both Courbet and Manet had a private exhibition directly across from the street from the entrance to the Universal Exhibition of 1867. I cannot believe that Aikens did not go in there. He went to the Universal Exhibition, I think 13 times, because he saved his ticket with all the punches in it. And I cannot believe that he did not see the work of Manet and of Courbet, because, for example, even, there we go. And they were also lampooned in the press at that time. And he wrote home about Aikens' letters, of course, a major source of information of his time in Paris. And he would have seen these caricatures. And exactly the two paintings of Olympia and the Déjeuner sur l'Air, which were at Manet's 1867 exhibition.
So then you also include this very just sort of provocative juxtaposition. Tell us about that.
Well, when I came across that photograph of this was his Susan Hannah McDowell, who was to be his wife, and I thought, that is so strange that he would pose her outdoors, naked in that pose with the knee. I mean, other than the fact that her hand is on her leg and she's not looking at you, but even in the lower left-hand corner where the still life is that Manet paints, there is a kind of conflagration of sticks and twigs and leaves that almost looks arranged. And I'm wondering whether he was doing a kind of, spoof or thinking of Manet. I can't prove it, but to me, it was very striking. Mm-hmm. So I just threw that out there.
What do you think about that one,
Lynn? Be all over me.
Lynn, what do you think about that one?
Well, I agree with Terry that I'd never, of course, seen this juxtaposition before, and who wouldn't think that it was deliberate? It certainly looks it.
Yeah,
I mean, the same kind of bent of the neck and, the little bit of breast showing underneath the arm. It was just, I thought, this is just a little too close to be, I don't know, to be happenstance. Only Aikens knows for sure, like his hairdresser, as they used to say.
Yeah. Well, what was it like, Terry, for you to, you're a very, very well-known scholar of French art. What was it like to sort of take the plunge into working on American artists?
Well, from the time that Lynn asked me, that wonderful fateful day, as I call it, and I just jumped into it. First of all, I've always loved Jim's writing. Lynn's writing. He and Jim wrote that wonderful book, City and Apart. I loved his novel, Crossing the Line, and I thought this would be really fun because I had taught American art just in surveys and a little bit, but I thought this gives me a chance now at the end of my career to really delve into a topic that I didn't know. I remember Erin Powell's, one of my colleagues, when I told her I was going to look into, she said, what are you doing this summer? I said, I'm looking into Aikens in France. She said, you're going to go down a rabbit hole. Boy, was she right. And I don't think I ever came up out the other side. But there were just so many avenues to go through and to learn about this that it was absolutely fascinating. And having Lynn's support, and reading his work as I went along, just kept me totally energized through the project.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that you jumped in and that you worked together, because this is quite the result. I wanted to ask both of you about the Quakers and their relationship to imagery. At one point, the book makes sort of draws a comparison between Puritan Boston, which sort of discouraged the use of images, and Philadelphia, which became a place where there was a strong market for visual images. But so how did it? But weren't the Quakers also sort of disapproving of images? And how did that shift happen so that images went from something that were considered maybe dangerous to something that was considered imperative in the building of this new nation?
Here's, if I may make a crack at that, and then Terry can correct me because I may well be wrong. But the sense I have is that it's really not until we get close to the period of the American Revolution when we begin to see more and more connections between the revolutionaries and France. Don't forget that the French sent a huge expeditionary force here to help us win that war. And then we had huge numbers of French people, comparatively speaking, settle in Philadelphia in the decade 1790 to 1800, when Philadelphia was capital of the new nation. And it's at about that time that we begin to see, I think, the French influence in and support of art infect the Americans. By this time, we have rich Americans like the Binghams, for example, William Bingham and his wife, who traveled in France and spent a good deal of time there, and they came back thoroughly infused with French ideas, particularly about high culture and art. And so it went. I think it's in this period that you begin to see the kind of refusal to entertain such notions among the Quakers just being overthrown. It's also the period, by the way, in which the Quakers are giving way, even among the English speakers, to Anglicans, to Episcopalians in Philadelphia. And they had never had any compunction about supporting the arts. Terry, what's your view?
I would agree with that, Lynn. Also, Quaker, the thing that most early American art was indeed portraiture. Yes. And the thing that was banned was, of course, the nude and any kind of art that revealed the body. And this is, of course, where Akins gets in trouble. When he, 4 years in Paris, he decides that, you've just got to be able to, paint the nude. Even Mary Cassatt, when she was admitted to the Academy, and they could not paint from the nude figure because they were women. So what she did, I think it was with a friend, I don't think it was Emily Sartain, but one other woman, is that they petitioned the Pennsylvania Academy to have a room of their own where they could paint from the female nude model themselves. So it's amazing. I mean, the Pennsylvania Academy is a whole story unto itself, and the influence of the Pennsylvania Academy right there on North Broad Street as the first art school in Philadelphia. I always call it the ancestor of Tyler School of Art, the great art school, and they held exhibitions, and it was the place to be. So the Quakers, and Franklin, of course, was a Quaker, and he was a great lover of the arts.
I wouldn't quite say that Franklin was a Quaker. He certainly
wasn't he? I thought he was. Sorry, Lynn. Thank you.
But I don't think he probably ever regarded himself as a full-fledged Quaker. He was too much a free thinker for that, I believe.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, I don't know the background of his religious thinking. Yeah.
I enjoyed reading the story, the part about Lafayette coming over and George Washington at first being annoyed by the sort of French aristocrats coming over and wanting to fight, because it was just too many people to kind of keep track of and look after. But Lafayette, he took a liking to him, and they had dinner together in Philadelphia. What was it about him that won over George Washington? Tell us about their relationship.
It's a remarkable story, and who knows what the dynamics are that make people decide they like each other or don't. Remember that Lafayette was only 19 years old when he came to Philadelphia. He was married, just married. Nobody in his family wanted him to come, but he came anyway, at Franklin's suggestion. And Washington, of course, was himself childless. There's definitely a father-son angle to their relationship, no question about that. Lafayette had never known his father, who had been killed in the one of those wars. I think Queen Anne's War, before he was born, in fact. So he'd never known his father, and here is this father figure, head of the Revolutionary Army, and they simply got on together, even though Washington, I'm sure, knew almost no French, if any, and Lafayette's English was pretty rough in the beginning, but they certainly bonded, and it was a bond that lasted throughout the rest of Washington's life.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think overarching question that I kept thinking about as I was reading was about the tension that I imagined that there was for American artists who are, looking to France as a model for making their art, but also wanting to create something that's kind of breaking with tradition, or wanting to create a visual of, a set of visual symbols that is new and that is distinctly American. How did artists negotiate that? And was that something that was discussed by critics? Like, did critics say, for example, about, I don't know, and I'm thinking just an American artist that was clearly influenced by France, this is too French, it should be more American?
Yeah, it happened with Henry and also with Glackens. Henry was called the Manet of Manhattan because he had adapted many of Manet's motifs and certainly the darker palette. But I think what happens is that artists, of course, all want to find their own voice. And I always think of Harold Bloom and the anxiety of influence. And I think what they did is that they learned their technique over in France, and they took some ideas over, but they wanted to create an authentic American voice. I think of the Pennsylvania Impressionist, Brian Peterson, has done just marvelous work from publications from the Michener Museum on the Pennsylvania Impressionists. And Guy Pendubois says that what he loved about their work was that they were distinctly American. They had the Impressionist touch, but their subject matter and their style, the roughness of their style. Redfield, who wanted to do everything at one go and who never really wanted to retouch anything, that there was a kind of gruffness and ethnicity to his paintings that really spoke of the American, the American and what being an American was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's shift to architecture for a minute, because we haven't talked about that, and there's obviously a huge influence there. Lynn, do you want to start us off? What's the French influence on architecture in Philadelphia?
Well, one always has to start, I think, with the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. No one who's ever come to Philadelphia can miss it, and anyone who's been to Paris must notice its a very great resemblance to the Champs-Élysées. There's no accident there, of course. Many of you know that the parkway was designed by two French architects, Paul-Philippe Cret and Jacques Grébert, who did not start as partners, as a matter of fact. Cret was the older man, and he was the first to have created a design for a diagonal parkway. This, by the way, was an idea that the powers that be in Philadelphia had been batting around for decades. starting right after the Civil War, because they really wanted to do a project which would connect downtown, Center City, Philadelphia, to this glorious new park, Fairmount Park, which had come into being before and after the Civil War. And by this time, Baron Haussmann in Paris had, of course, sort of set the stage for how one does this. He had knocked down huge areas of medieval Paris in order to build slashing boulevards, and architects around the world had taken notice of this. So Cret certainly grew up at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, or actually in Lyon in his case, knowing about all of that in Paris. And in America, that whole Beaux-Arts notion came to be known as the City Beautiful movement, somewhat later, of course, than the Beaux-Arts movement in France. But here is our parkway, which is very much like the Champs-Élysées, as you can see.
Photographed by Lynn himself. The photographs in the book were done by Lynn, which are beautiful. This is a beautiful photograph.
The City Hall Tower, of course, marks the terminus of the parkway. And if it resembles the Louvre, which is the terminus of the Champs-Élysées, no accident there either, because, of course, this is the largest Second Empire or French Revival piece of architecture in the United States, and was being completed about the time the parkway was being planned. It had actually just come to fruition. And of course, at the other end, instead of the Arc de Triomphe, we have the Philadelphia Museum of Art on Fairmount itself, with the boulevard down the middle. Now, that's a piece of it. We, of course, also have the Rodin Museum, which a little jewel box of architecture in a Beaux-Arts style right there on the parkway. We have any number of Beaux-Arts buildings. And Paul Cret, the man who was the chief architect for the parkway, also left us any number of other important architectural landmarks. How about the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, for example? He designed it. Also the Walnut Street Bridge over the Wissahickon, which, you know, if you've gone speeding up from Center City to Germantown and Chestnut Hill, and any number of other buildings in a more modernist style. He eventually developed what he thought of as a kind of stripped down classicism. You see it very plainly in the Federal Reserve Bank building on Chestnut Street, which was his design. Unfortunately, it's a style which very quickly became popular with the fascists and the Nazis in Germany. And so we got a little turned off of that look, but it was really Cret who developed it more than anyone else. And he was anything but a fascist himself. He was quite an avid Democrat and a lifelong Philadelphian once he moved here and started to work here.
Terry, do you want to add anything?
No, I know the architecture, Lynn did really a wonderful job with the architecture itself, and it really makes you look at the city with different eyes.
Yeah,
I learned a lot, you know, from that. Yes.
Me too. And I did not know that the Logan Square, the Logan Circle is an homage to the Place de la Concorde.
Yes, it is.
Yep, learned that.
I should add that Place de la Concorde has two fountains on each side, great big fountains, and an obelisk in the center. When Cret first designed the parkway, he pictured it with an obelisk in the center, but as it got modified, we ended up instead with the Great Swan Fountain, which is one of the most monumental fountains any place in the United States.
So thank you. And I think that I'm sure that there are lots of questions from the audience. So why don't I open it up to Q&A?
Good.
Wonderful. Thank you. This is just a fascinating conversation. I invite anybody who has a question to find on your computer screen the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and type your questions in there, and I will moderate them. There was a bit of a conversation going on in the chat about Benjamin Franklin. He was not a Quaker.
He was
Some folks
Anglican.
are
Thank you.
mentioning he was Anglican. He was not actually Anglican either. He was raised in the Old South Church in Boston. His parents were members there. He was brought up as a Calvinist. He considered himself a deist, not a theist, but a deist, believing in one providential God. Like many leaders in the country, he probably, I think he had a seat, a pew at Christ Church, and folks like Washington and others had seats at a number of different churches and of different denominations over time. And he would occasionally attend services there as well as elsewhere.
May I add a comment about Franklin and his religious views? For one thing, he was responsible, good civic guy that he was, leader in Philadelphia. He was responsible for launching the fund to raise money to create a tower on Christ Church. That was part of his ecumenical outlook, no doubt. At his funeral, we are told that every denomination, every sect represented in Philadelphia had someone, a priest or a parson or someone representing that organization, that sect, marching in the funeral parade.
Wow, that's really neat. So I'm going to start with the questions. I think here's one that's asked why, if you have any ideas of why Philly's German influence seems to be more widely recognized than its French influence.
I would start by saying because there are more Germans than French here. That's fairly simple. From an early day, remember, first of all, that the whole point of Penn creating Philadelphia and Pennsylvania was to invite in the homeless, to say you're all welcome. We're not religiously tied, we don't demand that you profess a particular faith. And so all were welcome. And Germans came here in large numbers early on and settled what came to be known as Germantown, as you no doubt know. There were masses of them. There were never nearly as many French people here as there were Germans, and later Italians, of course, or Irish. Those are three nationalities who sent more people to Philadelphia than the French did. What I think Terry and I argue in the book, because it's not a difficult argument to make, is that the French influence is distinctive in part because again and again, it's particular individuals, particular artists or architects, or in some cases, rich people like Stephen Girard, who left their mark, not masses of people from that country, but particular individuals, often highly educated. And of course, in the late 20th century, how about restaurateurs? Start with Georges Perrier and the influence he had, not only in creating one of the finest restaurants in America in his day, but also persuading by his influence any number of other French chefs, aspiring French restaurateurs, to open their shops in Philadelphia. That's only happened, after all, in the last quarter about of the 20th century and on into today.
Interesting. Which, getting to talking about food, there's a question about who wrote the section on French influence in food.
Lynn did.
Well, I guess I was more responsible than Terry, yes.
Yes, yeah, Lynn did that, yeah. I thought, and also I love the fact that he did the dîner en blanc, to call attention to that, how that has been adapted to Philadelphia, certainly before the pandemic.
I believe we argued that the dîner en blanc in Philadelphia, which is now an institution that's 8 or 10 years old, is the largest in the United States. It, of course, started as the idea of a Frenchman in Paris some years before that, and then spread around the world.
Interesting. And also, France provided support to the Union during the Civil War. And is that relationship, did you find in your research that relationship was captured anywhere in Philadelphia art or artists?
Terry?
No, I didn't. Not the Civil War. I did not come across anything about the French support of the Civil War, particularly. No, I mean, because, I was concentrating on Aikens, who was not all that interested in politics, except trying to keep out of the politics of the Pennsylvania Academy. And, bringing French ideas to Philadelphia, which were seen to be bizarre and also indecent. And then, of course, Mary Cassatt and Henry Ossawa Tanner repatriate to France because it was easier for, being of a minority gender, as Mary Cassatt was, and or sexuality, Mary Cassatt being a woman, and Henry Ossawa Tanner being a Black artist, they found that there wasn't the same prejudice, that there was more acceptance of them in Europe. Again, Mary Cassatt exhibited with the Impressionists, and Berthe Morisot had done so before her. And Tanner just thought that it was easier for him. He said, I just want to be an American art. I want to be an artist. He didn't want to be identified as a Black artist. And yet and he had great success in Paris. The funny thing that I found was that he lived in Paris for 2 years and was studying with at the Academy, I think at the Academy Julian, and he didn't know about the salon. And then one day coming out of church on a Sunday, he sees all these throngs going into the building. He thought, well, that looks interesting. He goes in and he finds it's the salon. And from that, he just gets the idea that he wanted to succeed at the salon. And indeed he did. He had a very successful career in Paris, and Philadelphia took great pride in that because he was awarded, he got awarded a second prize medal eventually at the Salon, which was the highest that a non-French person could get. And when the Philadelphia Press for an earlier painting, I think it was Daniel in the Lion's Den, where he had gotten an honorable mention, they mentioned the fact that he was Black, and they went to seek for a photograph of him, and they couldn't find one. So they just, as Tanner says in his, in an interview or something that he wrote, that they just got, somebody from the dockyard and photographed him and put it in. That was fine. He said it looked like maybe one of my older African ancestors. So, France was very welcoming and had far less prejudices in many ways to Americans. And to, people of race and of, it's not that somebody like Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt had an easy time of it, because they were not allowed to attend the École des Beaux-Arts. Women were not admitted to there until 1896. So they couldn't get the kind of professional training that other artists, who'd come over and could get into that school could do. But they made their way, and they made it very well.
So we've got a fun little question here, which ties us into the Athenaeum as well, Lynn, about Bonaparte's brother coming to Philadelphia. And was wondering if there's any special influence there, aside from the several paintings now part of the PMA collection. And so we can point out we have the huge Bonaparte collection at the Athenaeum. And do you want to say anything about Bonaparte and Philadelphia?
That's a good way to get into a comment on Bonaparte. The fact that you have the Bonaparte collection at the Athenaeum is, I must say, in some respects, entirely accidental. Bonaparte, Joseph Bonaparte, this is, about who I'll say a few words in a moment. When he died, he left that collection to his good friend and neighbor and a medical doctor, who, as I understand it, at his death, willed that collection to the Athenaeum. So Correct. It was not directly from Bonaparte himself. Joseph Bonaparte came to Philadelphia after his brother's second abdication, when it was quite clear that the game was up. And he first of all tried to persuade Napoleon to come to America. And Napoleon said, no, I'll stay right here and maybe they'll let me go into exile in England. Well, you know that didn't come about. But Joseph, nonetheless, came to America and fairly quickly decided Philadelphia was the place to be. He's reputed to have said that he thought the social life in Philadelphia sure beat that in New York. But in any case, he rather quickly he got in right away with Stephen Girard, who of course was an older man who had immigrated from Bordeaux at the age of 26, when he sort of happened to come up Delaware Bay in his sailing ship to escape from the blockade that the Brits had put up over the harbor of New York, sailed into Philadelphia, looked around, and stayed the rest of his life. In the process, he became the richest man in the country before he was finished, and of course, a great philanthropist. But back to Bonaparte, when Joseph Bonaparte arrived in Philadelphia and hooked up with Gerrard, of course, was very helpful to him. He not only shipped a lot of Bonaparte's goods back to Philadelphia from France, but he helped him find property. And Joseph rather soon bought a great big estate outside Bordentown, New Jersey, almost across the river from where William Penn had had his great plantation, Pennsbury Manor. And Bonaparte lived there for many years. He had the whole place rebuilt, a new house built, gardens designed, and so forth. Money was no object. And he appears to have been quite sociable. The Philadelphia elite obviously took to him. There were some suspicions at first that maybe he was up to no good politically and was trying to, who knew what, maneuver to restore himself to power in France. But it became fairly clear fairly soon that that really was not his game. He was just wanting to live well, and he was an admirer of the American Republic. He said, "It's a good thing you did. It was excellent for you to do this." So he stayed here off and on for most of the rest of his life, which comes to a total of something like 30 years. And he made lots of friends here. He actually offered his entire wonderful, apparently, collection of art to the Library of Congress. But guess what? They turned it down. And so he sold it off back in France. Almost all of it went back to France. But that's one of those stories of what might have been. But he was clearly a good friend to Philadelphia and to many of Philadelphia's elite in the period he was here.
There's a question, curious about any influence the French might have had on theater in Philadelphia.
Theater. I'm a little vague about this, I'm afraid. There was a hotel, Iller's Hotel, which in spite of the name was French. And I believe there were some theatrical productions there, but I'm sorry that I can't give you any details. This would have been early in the 19th century. Maybe someone out there knows more than I do about that and can fill us in.
Okay, so we'll see if anybody else answers. Zabeth is online. Hello, Zabeth. So glad you're here. And she's wondering if you would argue that the relationship between France and Philadelphia was overall organic or intentional.
Well, that's a very interesting way to put a question. Let's see, organic. I think it's probably more organic than anything else. But it's a mix. It's a mix. When you start with the fact that, of course, Benjamin Franklin arranged to get Louis XVI to support the American cause, that is to say, the insurgents' cause in the American Revolution, that made France our first and most valuable ally. So obviously there's gratitude there. But it's also true that we weren't very far into our new independence before there were some political problems between us and the French. We had a quasi-war during the period, which started in Washington's second term and into John Adams's term. It didn't actually lead to war, but it came close. And this had to do, of course, with the perturbation of the French Revolution and how it was received in America. So that clearly roiled the waters between France and America for a time. And I would say that starting perhaps with that, there was a sense on the part of those who liked France or loved France, like Jefferson and others, that they wanted to cultivate good relationships where they could. But it's also true that some of it just developed organically as people like Paul Philippe Cret happened to get a job at the University of Pennsylvania as a young man and stayed. Or that Stephen Girard happened into the port of Philadelphia when his ship was in some difficulty, looked around, liked it, and stayed. There are a number of stories like that, which suggest to me there's a kind of organic growth as well as intentional. But a nice question. Thanks, Zabeth.
Yeah.
Terry, from the art historical point of view, I think it was more intentional than organic, because after post-Civil War, artists began to flock to Paris to study. Walter Benjamin calls Paris the capital of the 19th century, which it really, in many ways, became. And again, as I said, it was the support for the arts and also the accessibility to the schools and for training. The Pennsylvania Academy teachers encouraged their students to go to Paris. I read the autobiography of Samuel Gross when I was working on Aikens, and didn't realize that Jefferson University, Jefferson Hospital was modeled on the French model, that the major surgeons were French, that Gross kept himself alive, by translating French books when he was a medical student and beginning to practice, and that he was very much enamored of the French model of surgery. And you could not study anatomy at the Pennsylvania Academy, so all the students went over to Jefferson Hospital to study there. But again, the intentionality of going over, everything begins to change then. I end with the Armory show, because that's when, the Americans begin to, it's sort of like the avant-garde. It becomes very much, the Impressionists become sort of old school. And they become the academy, and it's the Armory show where Henry and Glackens, and I defer to Martha because I learned so much about Glackens from her very fine essay in the Barnes catalog on Glackens in France, where they brought over the influences, but also tried to separate themselves from it. They wanted to find, again, their individual voice. And at the Armory show, Henry was afraid that the European art would overwhelm the American, and it did, certainly in the press, because Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, the Nude Descending a Staircase became one of the success to scandale, so to speak, of the Armory show. I mean, people thought it was just outrageous, and I'm always so glad it's in Philadelphia, that Duchamp collection. I never taught Duchamp in the classroom. We always went to, I wanted to play with my hands behind the glass and look in the peephole and things like that. And I miss the fact that the museum is now closed and I can't go. Same thing with the Barnes. I'm going through, great withdrawal, but I'm hoping this will pass soon.
We have so many questions, but we have time for one final one, and then folks are going to have to buy the book and read it and get their answers that way. This one's interesting. I wonder if you could address this one. We're talking about the French influence on Philadelphia, but how did the French see or speak about Philadelphia and its French influence?
That's a good question.
What comes to my mind immediately is an article that appeared in a French magazine, I think year before last now, which is titled something like, in French, Philadelphia, the Cradle of America, something to that effect. And actually the reporter who wrote that article contacted me while he was writing it. So needless to say, I fed him lots of stuff. And I would say that the thrust of that article was no surprise here. It was full of nice pictures and quite a lot of decent history about France, about Philadelphia. But it was meant to encourage French tourists to come here. And it suggested that maybe you don't know much about this city. You know Hollywood, and you know Miami, and you know New York, but you really ought to know more about Philadelphia. Now, that's a very contemporary attitude, and there have been other eras in our history when other French people have known more than may be true of the mass of French people today, but that's what comes to my mind first.
Mm-hmm.
Terry?
I can't think of anything, the French didn't come here to America a whole lot, as far as I may be mistaken about that, but the way that I see it is that Americans went over to France to learn, and then but Barnes, of course, had a tremendous influence, and his collection, he was seen as, the outrageous when he had his collection. People just did not understand the kind of art that he had. Whereas when Masbom brought the Rodin sculptures over, they were very well received. I think it's funny, Masbom, he and his brother started all the movie theaters in America. They had the motion picture theaters. And he wanted the Rodin sculptures to be, in the lobbies. And I can't imagine the Burghers of Calais right before you see Ben-Hur or something like that, at the movie. But You know, so the Mastbaum collection, the Rodin Museum is a real gift. And Mastbaum's generosity is that he also had the Gates of Hell finished and given to the Rodin Museum in Paris, which was did not have the money to do that. And so, you know, the French-American relations were interesting. It's also when the Frémier statue came over, you know, the testimony of the French person who was at the dedication was very complimentary and said how this would make, you know, the relation between France and Philadelphia, between these two cities, much stronger. And so a great deal to love.
Tell people which sculpture you're talking about.
The Joan of Arc sculpture by Frémier, Joni on the Pony, the gold one outside of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you know, on the, what is it? It's on the north side of the museum.
Well, thank you. This has been fabulous. There's so many people have so many questions. I hope you all notice in the chat, and it's here again. Links to buy the book will be are in the chat right now, and they will be emailed to you tomorrow if you didn't write those down. But it's tupress.temple.edu. If you go that far, you're going to you can search and find the book, but you'll get this link tomorrow. We hope you will buy it. There are questions on the chat if we will be having another gathering once we can safely gather together again so people can get their books signed by you. And from our conversations, it sounds like Terry and Lynn would love to be able to do that. So our hope is that we can do that.
Scratch the surface tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for, you know, to all the attendees. I really appreciate your interest in this, and thank you very much for attending.
Yes, thank you.
And we invite you. We're so glad you came. So thankful for our co-sponsors at the Alliance Francaise, the Barnes Foundation, and Temple University Press for helping make this evening possible. And invite you, if you enjoyed what you saw tonight, to subscribe to the Athenaeum bulletin to find out about upcoming programs, to join and become a member of our family of people who love to learn, and buy the book and attend future programs. And hope you all have a wonderful evening and stay safe and warm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And lots of thanks from everybody in the chat. If you both want to click on that and see what folks are saying.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
They're saying nice things.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much to all. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and you're being invited to Paris to come and present.